do unmute, but otherwise, please mute yourselves. Thank you. So again, if you have any questions, do message us. Here are the names of the Climate Justice Committee members. You can also recognize us by the fancy screen that I don't have because my computer is not updated to have that, but all the other people have it. So you can see us clearly with the screens. Okay, so that brings me to the first speaker of our event. Our first panelist sharing his individual take on COP26 and its climate justice perspective is youth. Youth is a 22-year-old Mauritian master student in global environmental governance, sustainability, and climate change at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. He did his bachelor's in political science at McGill University. He's passionate about climate change issues and fighting its impact on small islands developing states. He represented Mauritius as a delegate in the 16th United Nations Climate Change Conference of Youth held in Glasgow. And he is also the president and co-founder of a local humanitarian NGO called Food, Water, Hygiene Mauritius that seeks to support the population in need in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Very warm welcome to you, Youth. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the whole Climate Justice Committee. This looks like an amazing event, and I cannot be more grateful to be part of the event. So yes, I will be the first speaker, and my presentation will talk about, of course, COP26, but more specifically about small island developing states and the role it had in COP26 and what I personally think about the outcome of COP26. Next, yeah. So before talking about the actual COP, I figured that to some of the audience, the notion of small island developing states, it might be a little unfamiliar. So here's a little bit about it. So small island developing states, which from now on I will call SIDS, is a distinct group of 58 nation states. So when I say distinct, I mean that they are considered as a proper entity in the international sphere, like the least developing countries, which we call LDCs, for example. In terms of locations, SIDS are divided into three main subdivisions, which are, the first one is the Caribbean, where you can find countries like Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, or even Jamaica. The second location is the Pacific. So here you can find Vanuatu, Fiji Islands, and the Marshall Islands, and the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea is the third location, which is often called AIS because it's way too long. So here you can find the Seychelles, the Maldives, and Mauritius, which is my home country. So in total, SIDS have a population of 65 million inhabitants, which is less than 1% of the total population. And to have a little comparison, the total population of those 58 states equal the population of France. So yes, next slide, please. So for a more visual representation of small island states, here is a map where you can find so the Caribbean represented in red, the AIS represented in yellow, and the Pacific in green. Next slide, please. So in terms of global emissions, I think that it is crucial to firstly start by saying that SIDS are emitting less than 1% of global carbon emissions in total, while the G20, so the 20 most powerful countries in the world, they account for approximately 75% of those emissions. And even so, SIDS are in the front line of climate change repercussions for a lot of different reasons. If you want to go to the next slide. Okay, maybe the next one. So as I was saying, yes, SIDS are in the front line of the crisis. So in different reasons. So it can be either through rising sea levels, land loss and degradation of the land, extreme weather, or a natural catastrophe. All of those different impacts are heavily being seen in those islands. So those extreme weather phenomena have led to, as I said, land degradation, saltwater intrusion as well, scarcity of fresh waters in some specific countries, loss in biodiversity, especially in the oceans, and an unquantifiable impact caused by disease and loss of just economic wealth. So as a result of all of this, the smallest and least developed states face the greatest problems. They are some of the most vulnerable in the world and have contributed the least to cause climate change and have the most limited capacity to respond to this crisis. Next slide, please. So the scariest part of all of this is that these are not just, scary words meant for awareness. This is actually a reality that is currently happening. This reality was actually faced by my own country no more than 2 weeks ago when a cyclone called Batsirai passed. So the cyclone was registered as a type 4, which is the highest it can get in my country. And the measuring winds was as high as 150 kilometers an hour. So hundreds of people were displaced and more than 1,000 houses lost electricity. And as you might see in this picture, Mauritius was not the most impacted country. Madagascar was a couple of days later. And as you can see also in the picture, the little red line is Mauritius on the right and the La Réunion on the left. Yes, so now talking a little bit more about COP26, did the conference actually help and what was the impact of COP26, especially for SIDS? So it is quite fair to say that expectations were really high. After 2 years of preparation, a lot of people in my entourage were saying that this COP was a make or break situation. I'm sure that a couple of people here also heard about this saying. And islanders all around the world, they made sure that awareness was given to the event and that their needs and priorities were heard. So if you haven't seen already this picture, this made quite an impact. So here's the picture of Tuvalu's foreign minister addressing the challenges of his country in the face of the climate crisis. And he's actually in the ocean, and this was a huge symbol for that actually went viral. It was a great and such a big image that went around the world just to make sure that awareness was actually not only awareness but actual repercussions was already made. So next slide, please. Yes, so during COP26, SIDS leaders made sure that their voices were heard, especially with a lot of quite emotional and emotional speeches, I would say. So I particularly like this quote from the president of Palau that pretty much says, "You might as well bomb our islands instead of making us suffer only to witness our slow and fateful demise." Yes, so this illustrates, I think, very well the idea that at the end of the day, there is so much that SIDS can actually do. We need powerful leaders to commit and ensure that concrete actions actually follow a lot of words that have been said to the conference. Next slide, please. Yes, so coming into COP26, those islands, and especially the Alliance of Small Island States, which is the negotiating bloc of island nations, wanted to highlight 3 specific and crucial points. The first one was ocean-related issues. So this englobes ocean pollution, overfishing, coral conservation, and maritime transports. The second measure was adaptation and mitigation. So if you don't really know what it is, the amazing vocabulary sheet can help. So the battle for adaptation policies has progressed. It's been, I would say, more than a decade that it has progressed, but it's still not enough. And lastly, the last measure that really was on the priority list was loss and damage. And of course, it's an issue that not only touches small island states, but also the global south in general. So yes, so how did all of those lists and awareness raising and just activism translated in COP26 from a SIDS perspective? If I'm being honest, I cannot really hide my deception regarding the results. The first reason why is mainly, and I'm sure a lot of people heard this, is the lack of representation surrounding COP26. Because of the current situation that is happening, the global pandemic, a lot of people that are delegates from those islands, they couldn't actually come to Glasgow, whether it was from vaccines or visa registration or just plain financial issues. There has been a lot of different delegates that couldn't come. Because of many restrictions, it was just an unequal and very biased, I would say, conference as a whole. And not only SIDS, but I think a lot of people are going to talk about it later, but it was a very, yeah, I would dare to say kind of biased conference, which we did not definitely want. So the second reason I think it was kind of a mitigated result is the phase down versus phase out debate. Not necessarily because of the word itself, but just because of what it means overall. So more than just a play on word, I believe that it means so much more. While we are in a climate crisis, India decided to change the word out to down. So in other words, one of the most powerful and polluting countries in the world had so much influence that it decided to tune down its commitment. And what I just think is, what does this actually say in the power relations of international negotiations? And what does this actually say about equality and fairness for those who, on the opposite of India, do not pollute and are not structurally powerful? The third reason is the topic of ocean. So as I said before, it was on the top priority list for the AOSIS, and in the final agreement, the Glasgow Climate Pact, there is only one reference of the ocean in the Glasgow in the pact. Yet a large part of SIDS economies is based on the ocean, whether for fisheries or just tourism. It's a huge sector. I definitely think that more work needs to be done next year and in the following years, just to make sure that the ocean is represented as much as it needs to be represented. And lastly, it is the loss and damage compensation. From the different articles that I read and from what I saw, loss and damage, of course, is more than crucial. And this year it has been more of a discussion point rather than an issue to be tackled. So I would definitely say that I've been deceived regarding this, especially, special thought. And there is a lot of talk about it, but no real action yet. So, yes. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope I wasn't too long. Yeah, I'm glad to answer any questions at the end of all of the other presentations.
Thank you very much, Eve, for sharing your perspective. I would now like to introduce Isadora. Isadora is a queer feminist, climate activist, and expert based in Berlin. They hold a master's in globalization and development studies and are currently a fellow with the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany, researching the debate and pathways on the just energy transitions in Brazil and Germany. Isadora has been working with research, project management, and advocacy on intersectional climate change over 6 years at NGOs, think tanks, and international organizations in Brazil, Germany, and internationally. Isadora, we are very much looking forward to listening to your perspective. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, the organizing committee, for the invite. I'm very excited to be here today and sharing a little bit about my views and my experience attending COP26. As you mentioned, I've been following this debate on the climate negotiations for some years now, since 2017, especially with the constituency of the women and gender. And so back then, when I started following, I was working with NGOs, with a feminist NGO, and we were part of the women and gender constituency. And we are still mainly focused on mainstreaming and also making sure that gender considerations are streamlined into all the decisions of the conferences, the climate conferences. And just to give a little bit of background of where I stand and where I come from. So last COP, it was no different. Like I was doing my research. I was there as an independent researcher, mostly looking for groups working on just transition and for events and negotiations under just energy transition, but still trying to follow it from the Women and Gender constituency and other allied constituencies and groups participating at the COPs, which are concerned on climate justice issues. And so after the conference, we had some debrief calls with different groups. And I think the overall idea and sensation from these groups that I participate, but that I also transit in, is that indeed COP26 did not deliver into all the high expectations that we as climate justice groups from around the world had, from finance commitments to loss and damage facilities, which was again something which was not tackled, as you've mentioned. It was only a matter of talk again, but not really delivering a mechanism that would make countries facilitate that developing countries could, for example, access funding or access other mechanisms to compensate the losses and the damages that that are actually responsibility or historically responsibility from the most emitting countries, from the developed countries. And so this was, I would start from one of the last points that you've mentioned. This was indeed one big failure of this conference, the issue of loss and damage that I think still groups will bring into the conversation because it's a key, also it's a key point on climate justice in itself, because it tackles the issue of reparations and historical responsibility between North and South. And so this is a matter that I think many of the groups and seeds also will continuously bring to the table and hoping to be addressed. And another point that I wanted to address here is the issue on just transition, which is the one that I'm more focused lately on in terms of my research. After many years trying to also address the matter of phase out of fossil fuels in the climate negotiations, in the official negotiations, finally at last COP we had for the first time, despite this weak language or this weakened language in the last days of the negotiations, we had for the first time the text of the official negotiations saying that, let me pick here what was written. Yeah, so this official call for accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuels subsidies. So it was a celebration on the one hand, but still not so much, because the mechanisms or the follow-up instruments for such a commitment in this official decision were not delivered, or were not really part of the conversation. And so what we witnessed as well, climate justice groups witnessed, was that many of them, like especially in terms of energy transition issues and commitments, they were more ambition was delivered outside of the negotiations. It was a highly co-opted COP, if I could say it like that, in terms of we had a really massive participation of corporations, big corporations around the pavilions, taking a lot of space, and also taking a lot the language and cooptating a little bit of the language that that is in the climate conference, for example, for their interests. And so we could see not only in the pavilions, but indeed into the final text, the official texts, that this very strong lobby from, let's say, the fossil fuel companies was present there, and they really influenced this process, so that the language was not so strong in terms of energy transition issues. And yeah, so from our perspective, from my perspective, sorry, and also from other perspectives of groups that I follow, like like the CIO, the Center for International Environmental Law, they have mentioned, they have written a really good analysis on COP26 outcomes, highlighting that in terms of energy transition, there were many more commitments outside of the official negotiations. And one thing that I can mention as an example is that developed and developing countries alongside multilateral banks have committed to stop or to defund, to stop international public support for the clean energy transition by the end of this year. And this agreement is really important in the view of some NGOs such as Oil Change International, because it agrees on shifting international investments from fossil fuels, including coal, oil, and gas, towards clean energies by the end of 2022. And despite this was a big celebration, because divestment and end of subsidies is indeed one of the main means and strategies to the energy transition and to stop fossil fuels. Still, when it's not under the convention, it's not really clear how these mechanisms, which were agreed in parallel to the convention, how they will be followed up, especially also because they have been agreed with multilateral banks or also with private actors. And so despite this was celebrated by some groups, the way that it will be implemented is not clear, because it's really not something that is under the official negotiations. And there were many other commitments agreed by countries bilaterally, or many countries together, and also with the private sector on deforestation, on many issues that were celebrated alongside the parallel to the negotiations. That was a mark of this conference. And to end, because I think, I don't know if I haven't looked at the time, but I don't know if I have much time, but I wanted to mention the importance also in this COP of the parallel conference, which happened thanks to the really big coalition formed by civil society, by Scottish and UK-based civil society groups for climate justice. They have organized a really important and a really big movement inside of the UK, within the UK, but also in cooperation with climate justice groups from around the world, to make the People Summit for Climate Justice possible, which was happening alongside in around Glasgow, not only, and also online. And this conference was really, really important for the people for the people from the city and people visiting, for example, the city of Glasgow, but also people not being able to be there to follow online what the climate justice movements were discussing, the perspectives that they already had and the solutions they already had for the issues that were under the negotiations, the official negotiations, but also to hear how they would be criticizing what was going on there. So solutions, but also some of the, they would follow up daily the negotiations and would bring their perspectives and share with the public. So this was a very important space for us from the climate justice movement to attend and to participate, and also to the local population and the groups around the world interested in climate justice issues from different perspectives. Do I still have time? Yes.
I think you still have how much time? Maybe a minute or two.
Okay.
Conclusive statement.
Okay. So last point I want to make is also connected to the issue that I work on, intersectional justice, is the matter of participation. And I think many of you might also have noticed it if you attended COP, and also from reading many reports about the conference, that they wanted, like the COP presidency really wanted it to be a very inclusive and participatory COP after 2 years of preparation, after so many difficulties to organize it with the pandemics. And we do have people who attended, and I myself, for example, I could see that there was indeed some more inclusion of groups that I've never seen before attending that conference. For example, in the case of the Brazilian delegation that I was following more like closely, I could see for the first time the attendance of the Black movement there. And that was really a mark for the climate justice movement in Brazil to be able to like organize and send a delegation of the Black movement to the conference. So indeed, it was really an important mark and an important conference for like more diversity, but that diversity was not necessarily reflected in the outcome, because the diversity was not of the people and the diverse interests, especially from civil society groups and observers, they were not really included in the talks and in the final decisions. So we do have, the impression is that, and I share this impression with others, that there was more participation in diversity in this COP, but still the interests of those different groups and these diverse groups that attended, for example, for the first time, were not reflected in the official decision. So basically, we still need to do a lot of work, and we still need to keep going much more to this conference so that this participation turns into really effective decisions. And so this is my last point to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isadora, for giving your perspective. I would now like to introduce Veerle. Veerle is a youth activist and organizer from the Netherlands. During her time with JEMA, she founded and facilitated the Climate Justice Committee, which is a space which is primarily dedicated towards broadening and deepening the conversation around intersectional climate justice and what it should entail. Veerle has also founded the youth-led Climate Solidarity Coalition, along with other organizations. The primary goal of the coalition is to demand a central place for Indigenous and other grassroots perspectives within the Dutch climate debate and movement. Veerle, over to you.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you everyone for being here. Thanks for having me, and thank you to Isadora and you for providing such incredible insight into this space. I'm really thankful for having had this introduction into what I'm about to tell, because it really follows quite naturally. Also, a note, although I am from Amsterdam, I'm reporting live from Sydney, so it's currently 4:35 a.m., which means I've only had a couple hours of sleep, so I'm a bit slow. Please bear with me. I don't really have slides, although I do have a link to the Instagram post that I did send. I don't know if someone could pull it up, or if not, that's fine too. So thank you so much. Okay, so I would like to start today in a little bit of an unusual way. I'd like to actually talk to you a little bit about the problems of COP as a physical space of censorship, through telling you a very brief story about a t-shirt. And I'd like to first root this story into a little bit of theoretical context. And that is to start with the statement that the climate crisis is indeed a colonial crisis. And to make sure that we're all on the same point, I'll just give a very brief explanation of what this means. And I'll share a link actually to a good article in the chat after I'm done. So in their article, Colonialism, the Climate Crisis and the Need to Center Indigenous Voices, Martinez and Irfan claim that climate change is rooted in the exploitation and degradation of the planet, peoples and cultures, which were the foundational principles of colonialism. From the subcontinent to Africa and Africa to the Americas, colonialism as an ideology sought to enrich Europeans at the expense of all else, while extracting resources and treating many indigenous peoples as commodities. Now, following this, it makes sense that no conversation about climate change or climate justice can be taken seriously without an acknowledgement of this violent colonial history. And according to this logic, it only makes sense that corporations and governments the world over continue to hoard wealth and resources, pillaging the earth and its communities today, and also that this is the context that COP has taken place in as well. And now, for those of you who didn't make it to the COP itself, a little note about what the space is like. Everything that is to do with decision-making and negotiations takes place in a space called the Blue Zone. And just for your reference, I think the Blue Zone is probably one of the most exclusionary and highly securitized spaces that I've ever been to, potentially even worse than airports, especially considering the fact that climate justice is discussed within this space. It just doesn't make sense. And those of us privileged enough to even be able to make it to Glasgow and into the COP were subjected to very strict security, customs before entering the Blue Zone, and the space itself was incredibly businesslike and sterile. So it's not a very welcoming or accessible space to begin with. Now to the story, and I'll be very brief here. In light of what I told you earlier, I'd made it my mission to wear a t-shirt inside the Blue Zone every day that said the climate crisis is a colonial crisis, just to spread awareness silently. And for the first 2 days, I was fine. No one pulled me up on it. And on the third day, as I walked through security with the shirt on, I was taken from security, confronted by 3 different security guards, told to take off my shirt, had it confiscated, and had my details recorded and reported. And this was all under the premise that it was said to be displaying messages that were too political to be worn inside the Blue Zone. Now, this is something that I'd like to reflect on. This is something that really got me thinking. And of course, we knew that the COP was going to be exclusionary from the beginning, but to be inside that space, confronted with that, is a different experience. Because I think it means that we need to reflect upon questions like who decides what is political and what is not political, and more importantly, what counts as too political to be discussed at arguably the most important moment in human history? And what does this say about the nature of these climate talks, whose voices are heard in this space and whose concerns, which realities are spoken, which remain unspoken? Because in saying that something is political, we're thereby also implying that something else is not political, and that the aim should be to keep this space free of the political, right? So the Blue Zone in itself, the climate talk, should be depoliticized, which I think couldn't be further from the truth. Also couldn't be further from productive, and also denies the fact that everything that goes on inside the space is extremely political. If we look at the kind of narratives that are being sold to us, and the way in which, as Isadora has also given insight into, the way in which corporations are being given a platform, whereas so many people are not, that in itself is propaganda, and that in itself is highly political. So it's these questions that I'd like to ponder tonight, and it's also these questions which I think really, to its core, shape the reality that is COP and the current state of the world. And so to think a little bit about what this messaging means, so what were the main things decided at COP, and what do these decisions ultimately mean for people? I'd say that the biggest takeaway is this fact, the fact that it's such a political space, and that this space is ridden with political messaging that prioritizes polluters over people at every cost, in every single way. And so does everything in its power really to keep the critical narratives at bay. And so I'm thankful for Isadora in mentioning and in pointing out that diversity may indeed have increased visibly, though this is largely cosmetic and performative, I would say. And that's what we've established already as well. Yeah, sorry, I'm just keeping track of where I am. Yeah, because this is just so clear in the way that polluters were platformed, and that there was still, even though there was an increase in diversity, there was still a gross underrepresentation of grassroots, Indigenous, youth, peasant, and peasant voices, as well as the fact that Black people, excuse me, and people of color were vastly underrepresented in this space. Not to mention vaccine apartheid, visa regulations. This within itself is political at its core, and it's a choice, moreover. It's a choice to platform one voice and to exclude, silence, obliterate, ignore other voices at the expense of these other voices. So really, COP26 was marketed to the public as a time of international collaboration for the good of the planet, whereas in reality, the only real collaboration at COP was between government officials and fossil fuel executives to protect profits, including at the expense of the people and the planet. And so to talk a little bit about the second question, what then does this mean? Now, in prioritizing polluting governments and big corporates in a space like COP, the vast majority of people that are affected right now are clearly silenced, as I already pointed out, particularly when talking about false solutions such as net zero or carbon trading, solutions which are definitely not legally binding in ensuring targets to cut carbon emissions. It is obvious that the gatekeepers of COP do not have communities and ecosystems on the front line as their priority in any way. Further, obviously, protecting the climate is not just about keeping temperatures below a certain threshold. And this is actually even something that is, in comparison to what was discussed, net zero over 1.5 degree heating of the earth. It's just, it wasn't even on the agenda in the way that it should have been. And even if it was, it's about much more than that, right? So protecting the climate means platforming the voices that are most affected right now. It means partaking in radical joy and choosing optimism over cynicism, definitely things that weren't part of this space. And above all, protecting the climate means that the people and the planet are platforms rather than polluters. So inside the COP, we saw many different forms of silencing, one of them being the confiscating of political messaging, going against or heavily regulating different forms of protesting. So the kinds of protesting that were allowed needed to be under heavy supervision, needed to go through several rounds of authorization, making it all very convoluted and not a very free space indeed to be speaking up or standing up for your rights. So where do we go from here? Because this is a very bleak picture, I do realize. We, in the smallest way possible, took action into our own hands whilst at COP when all of this was going down. And what we did was organize a small action, even in going through, having to go through all these rounds of authorization and having to explain yourself as to why it is important to be able to include this kind of action inside the blue zone. We did go ahead, and you can see here on the main slide that this is what it looked like. So the idea was that we would be raising awareness surrounding the issue of censorship and silencing that goes on within the blue zone. So I think in thinking about where to go next, that is probably the one message that Glasgow did bring home. So as much as the blue zone was exclusionary and felt like a defeating experience in itself, as much as the space itself represented a very skewed picture of where our priorities lie, and also a very limited way in which we were able to interact and act upon the things that were necessary. And Isadora also touched on this, the space outside of COP was one of building movement. So it really felt like there was a movement that was brewing. International solidarity was at the forefront. And I think if we're thinking about where we go next, it's about thinking about ways in which we could foster that international solidarity, create a movement of movements outside of these conventional and traditional spaces, because obviously we're entering a year of the 27th COP. Why have we already gone 26 COPs without seeing any real and meaningful change, right? It's in the streets and in looking forward to building a movement of movements with international solidarity at its core that we're really going to be able to draw together all these different corners of the earth and give a platform to all the voices that need to be heard most desperately at this very moment. I think that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Veerle, for your very interesting outlook. I would now like to introduce Stuart. Stuart is an associate professor in sociology of education at the University College London. His research and teaching focus on issues of educational equality and justice in a global context, and on alternative forms of radical, popular, democratic, and environmental education. He is the author of several very interesting books, including Youth Rising, The Politics of the Youth in the Global Economy, and Educating for Radical Social Transformation in the Climate Crisis. Stuart, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And there were some slides. Is that, do you have some slides up?
Oh, sorry, I don't think we have them yet.
Slides. Okay, I'll do this without.
Maybe you can share them for your computer. Wait a moment. Sorry for that. I'll make you co-host and then you can.
All right.
Sorry.
So I just get this set up and. Okay, does that work? You can see the slides. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So I wanted to make some comments about climate change education and climate justice in the context of COP26. And if you look at the reports, I wasn't at COP26, but if you look at the reports that come out of COP26 around climate change education, I think it's really a story of very mixed messages, right? So on the one hand, I think there's really some positive signs, some successes in that education was clearly seen as being central to any strategy to address the climate crisis. I think this was marked by this meeting of ministers of education and environment that I put on the slide here, where they issued a collective statement about the importance of developing education with some quite strong language, education to support the development of urgent action to combat climate change. There were, I think, about 20 odd national commitments to developing climate change education made at COP26, all of which was good. On the other hand, there's a long trend of making strong statements that aren't followed up by action, and there were also a lot of things missing, right? So there wasn't a lot of attention to climate change education that directly addresses issues of climate justice. There really wasn't kind of think about education and its vital role for enabling systems change, right, as opposed to individual behavior change. So it's kind of this mixed messaging, and I think this is a pattern that we see a lot right now in climate change education. Just around the time of COP26 here in the UK, the government, as host of COP26, put out a new draft strategy, right, that it was claimed was putting climate change at the heart of education in England, that was supposedly going to be empowering young people to take action on the climate crisis. So kind of very positive sign. But in this draft strategy, it's quite a short document, and yet even in that short document, the government took pains to make these points that I've highlighted on the slide here, that education should be politically impartial, and that teachers should not be encouraging students to go out and join campaigns or join protests. The Minister of Education, Nadim Zahawi, was talked to the media at the time, raising the possibility of fines for students who left school to participate in protest and so forth. So again, this really mixed messaging here. In the lead up to COP26, Education International, so this is the umbrella group of teacher unions around the world, released a study of national climate change policies that I put on the slide here. This is available online. You can download it and have a look at yourselves. On the one hand, there's a lot of countries that are developing national climate change education policies. So there is a lot of action here. But when EI looked at a number of specific issues, so does this education address climate justice? Does it address issues of inclusiveness, other kind of measures of quality? It found that almost all of these national climate change education policies failed miserably on all these counts that they were looking at. So again, this mixed messaging. And so for me, there's a question of how do we understand what's going on here? There seems to be a lot of positive stuff around climate change education, but also really this concerning absences and problems. And I think there's a book that Michael Mann had come out last year or the year before on the new climate war that I think is helpful here. And what Mann is talking about in this book is arguing that kind of climate change denial is becoming less of a powerful force, that this kind of growing kind of acceptance of climate change is real, it's happening, it's something it's important that we need to do something around. But Man makes the point that doesn't mean that climate wars are over, but they're transitioning to a new type of climate war. And a lot of the kind of struggle is around the responses that we make to the climate crisis. How are we going to do the responses to different climate crises? And Man raises concern that a lot of groups that are supporting continuing the status quo are promoting supposed solutions or responses to the climate crisis that don't actually address the core problem in the climate crisis. Nancy Fraser in New Left Review had an article out last year that made a very similar point. So making this argument that climate crisis has now become something that all political groups need to engage with, from the far left to the far right of the political spectrum. And so that if groups are making statements around climate, the climate crisis, or things like climate change education, they're not all on the same side, right? The battle is over the different kinds of responses that are being made to the climate crisis and the different interests and agendas that are being served by these different responses. And I think this is what's happening. We see this happening in the field of climate change education at the moment. That there's kind of growing kind of recognition that there's going to be support for climate change education, but the key issue is what kind of climate change education. And this was an article by Kate Greer and Melissa Glacken, just came out at the end of the year, raising concern about kind of activist call for more climate change education in the curriculum, or making it compulsory, or getting climate change into the schools, and insisting that the question really needs to be focused on is what kind of education are we talking about here? And in the last few years, there's been a growing number of people talking about different kinds of climate change education using different kinds of words. So sometimes talking about transformative climate change education, or transgressive climate change education, sometimes climate justice education, sometimes simply quality climate change education. I like to use the word radical education to talk about the same kinds of things, because for me, if what is needed to address the climate crisis is radical social transformation, then what we need in education is a kind of education that embraces the goal of radical change as a necessary and legitimate goal of education, right? And doing the other kinds of things, focusing education on really learning what needs to be changed in society, what do we really need to transition towards, how can we make this happen through learning how to build power, take action, and really seeing this as about learning how to fight, right? That there are groups that are going to be more interested in perpetuating the status quo. Sometimes climate change education takes on this apolitical, we're all in this together kind of framework, which I don't think is particularly helpful. If we think about this issue, not just about climate change education generally, but some kind of radical or transformative climate change education, then I think the story is really different. It's not a mixed message story. It's a really difficult story. And there's clear obstacles to developing an effective radical form of climate change education. So Christina Kwok and colleagues, Christina Kwok's affiliated with the Brookings Institution, have pointed out all these different kinds of structural obstacles that stand in our way if we're trying to develop a more radical form of climate change education, right? The global education community doesn't have a clear radical vision of education. Education systems tend to be very resistant to bringing in these kinds of radical changes. So there's really kind of a struggle in terms of developing this kind of education in informal education systems. But there's also, I think, internal obstacles. I've put on the slide here an article that just came out this year. This was a study of international climate change education, kind of more critical forms of climate change education through global citizenship education. And what the authors argue is that students, when they were taking these programs, even when they understood climate crisis as having structural causes, whether it's in capitalism or other kinds of structural causes, when it came to taking individual action, tended to revert, when it came to take climate change action, tended to revert to individual actions, to individual behavior change, to individual consumerist decisions, and so forth. And they argue that part of the reason is the kind of dominance of kind of neoliberal thinking, that we tend to focus on individual acts, individual responsibility, but part was also kind of a confusion and an uncertainty about how can we participate in more collective acts that target these structural causes of climate crisis. There's a missing education there. So I think there are these kind of different challenges that are really important to be aware of. But the last thing that I want to kind of end with is that if we see what we're trying to do in climate change education is developing a radical form of education, then there are long, rich traditions of radical education in most countries around the world that we can learn from and draw upon. Right? And these are not forms of education that focus on climate crisis. They're not often forms of education that focus on the environment even, but they're forms of education that have been developed specific on the question of how do we use education in support of projects of radical social change. I put on the slide here Highlander Folk School that some of you may be familiar with. It's in the United States, which in the 1930s through the 1950s supported first labor organizing, the development of the labor movement in the country, and then in the 50s, the civil rights movement. But there are many, many other examples from traditions of radical education. And for me, this kind of turning away from the kind of the COP and the apolitical spaces in that, and kind of taking time to learn these rich histories of radical education, it gives me hope and does seem like a way forward. So I'll end there, and we'll stop sharing my screen.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you for sharing your unique perspective, especially from climate change education. I think that was really interesting as well. And that's actually also the perfect transition and bridge towards our next speaker, Anna, whom I have the pleasure to introduce now. She's a sustainability educator. And just to give some background for all of us, she's a lecturer in sustainability at the Institute of Environmental Studies at the VU here in Amsterdam. She holds a bachelor in environmental engineering from the Sao Paulo State University in Brazil and a master's in energy and environmental science from the University of Groningen. She further has experience in teaching and research at the high school level and at developing educational programs in Brazil, and has more recently continued to develop her skills in the topics of knowledge, education, and engagement related to climate change adaptation in her work with the international organization Global Center on Adaptation. So after this, I think, really short, inspiring introduction to your work, Anna, I will hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Nick, and everyone from the organization. It's a huge pleasure to be talking with you all today, especially after those amazing talks. I'm very, very inspired, and I have to thank especially because the invite came from one of my students, and I'm very happy that you think I can contribute. So I hope so for this discussion. Well, so I think it's a very nice bridge because I'm going to talk a little bit about food justice and COP26. And then you may think, but we've been talking so many different aspects, the seeds and climate and education, how we can relate to food justice. So I think in the end of my short talk in 8 minutes, we can see how everything comes together. Yeah, so next slide, please. So before we start talking about the COP and food justice, same as you did, I just want all of us to be in the same page. So what we need to understand, of course, what food justice is about. So when we talk about food justice, basically it's about access. So to ensuring universal access to nutritious, affordable, and culturally appropriate types of food. But then one very interesting thing that food justice takes into account, it's the people involved in the food production systems. So we need to make sure that the people involved in the food production system, it's also with their well-being, as well as with their safety. So those are very important aspects when we talk about food justice. Okay, next slide. Sorry, I love animation, so you see that there's a lot of animations in my slides. Sorry for that. But before we start talking on regards to the COP, again, there are so many interesting concepts when we talk about food justice. But I want to bring two for you, which are like core concepts for us in food justice, so that we can think about those concepts and what happened at the COP in the end in a more critical way. So when it comes from food security, this definition is from FAO 2003. However, we've been seeing discussions and definitions about food security for long times, from the 80s and so on. And then if you see like this development of those definitions, you see that it's like very similar. And then just one word additions come up, which makes a more complete type of definition. So basically, food justice is when that exists, food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, meeting their dietary needs, but also their food preferences to have this healthy life in general. Interesting to say that a difference from, I think it's 96 to 2003, the definition was very similar. They used one, and they added the social word, a word that, well, a lot of people maybe in the 90s didn't thought it was very important when you talk about food security. And now we know that it's extremely important. But besides food security, there is another definition that for me is quite important when we talk about food justice, that is food sovereignty. And then food sovereignty basically is this right of local people to control the food systems in different manners. So in terms of market, ecological resources, food cultures, and production modes. But what I think is important about food sovereignty when we discuss about it, it's like where this discourse started from. So it started from actually the civil society and NGOs, and of course aligns more with this Marxist political economy, ecology discourses, which is within academia, but also outside academia, which is interesting to see where these come from. And here I want to make a bridge what's been discussed by Veerle, by you, Isadora, which are the role of the people, right? The role of the people involved in those movements. Yeah, so now we can move forward. And we can go to finally the discussion what was there in the COP. So I divided those parts in three main aspects. So the first of all, it was what was discussed during the COP. And before we make more a critical analysis, I'm just going to the facts at this stage. So of course, we won't be able to discuss all of them, but I brought some of the interesting ones. This was the first time in a COP that agroecology was discussed, and it was suggested to be included within the drafts. And why this is well important, because as Isadora said in her talk, there was also in this term of just transition to energy, also this shift of investments. We can also see like a little bit of shift from this power of big corporations to the agroecology system type of working. But of course, well, it was not included if you see the final document, but it's, well, it was there in a way that it's going to be discussed in future COPs. So it's a good start, let's say, like a good first step. Of course, we had a lot of, as we heard from everyone that already talked, a lot of pledges, speeches, initiatives, coalitions in regard of food, land, and nature. But when we talk about food, you see that much more is related to land and nature conservation, for example, like reduction of emissions of agricultural process, and so on and so on. And in regard to that, a lot of was discussed also in terms of how to act and finance in regards to a more sustainable supply chain for, again, protecting the nature. Okay, but then you say, Anna, there is a lot of discussions, those people talk a lot, we know, but what was decided in the end? Well, there's a lot of things that were decided. And I want to highlight 2 points here for you. The first one of them, it's about the climate pledges. If you look, there are tons of different climate pledges that were made during the COP, but I want to focus a little bit in one related to the countries. So I just brought it as one example, Australia. So Australia, it's the biggest exporter in terms of cattle, and well, they revisited their agreements in terms of their agricultural production to reduce emissions. So this is one thing that I want to bring for you. You know, this more easy part where we're going to say we are going to shift to reduce emissions. And then another one that it's an interesting one. It's the so-called policy action agenda for a just transition to sustainable food and agriculture. So this is an effort that was led by the COP26 presidency, the World Bank, and the Just Rural Transition. And this agenda was supported by 16 countries, which represent 11% of the global agricultural emissions. And then basically this agenda includes a lot of things, but one of interesting that comes that's like they are reproposing the agricultural subsidies for that incentivize harmful agricultural practices, investment in research. And I think this is last one is quite interesting, which is the development of agricultural innovation and designing inclusive processes for consulting and communicating with stakeholders, which like start connecting a little bit with those grassroots and the people in the ground. But okay, so those are just like tangible decisions. If you go to websites, you can find all of these. I think it's not the most interesting part. So now you can say, okay, Anna, but we saw the discussions, we saw the decisions, but what's next, right? So what are the next steps? What all of this means actually to food justice? So one first point that I want to make for you, it's about ongoing discussions and follow-ups. So if you see food systems in general, it's not something that it's really discussed within COPs. And this one, at least, if you see, well, the follow-ups, it was at least discussed. So people say, well, good first step. However, we need to think about what's going to be the role of food systems and especially food justice in future COPs, because this is a first step, but what does it mean for the future? And not only for the future COP, but also Isadora talked a lot about the mechanisms, right? What are the mechanisms that are there in place, making sure that we can transit and not wait to the next COP to start discussing it all about and to see what worked or not. So then it turns me to my last point, and I think the most important one is for us to think about what are the roles of the stakeholders involved within the COP and within the food systems when we talk about food justice. So I brought to you two important definitions for me, which is food security and food sovereignty. And then just remembering a little bit about those concepts, think critically with me if I spoke of any decision or even discussions that took into account those concepts. And then we are going to see that the discussions, they are much more related to the food systems, not to the other aspects, which do not consider the people on the ground, do not consider all the stakeholders involved. And then while everyone was talking, I was just making notes of interesting quotes that you're saying. So you've said to us about the bias of the COP, right? Of the people involved and the people that, well, had the power to decide, but the people they are going to, well, suffer or to have the impact. Isadora said to us about the diversity, that it was not reflected in the outcome. And then we also see that Veerle said to us that, well, people didn't feel welcome and it's not an accessible place. So my question to all of you is that, and for us to discuss and think together, because I think it's like the 1 million question, how we can make those people in the ground accounted and connected. How can they really be heard, but not only heard, but that those pledges are also made into mechanisms of transformation and inclusion, because we heard a lot that COP26 was about inclusiveness. And when we see the outcomes, actually what we see is that it was not as inclusive as the other COPs that we see so far. So yeah, I would like to finish in here with this, this room for thoughts, and thanks once again the Commission and for an invitation. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you. I see a lot of people clapping, virtual clapping. So thank you very much for sharing your perspective. Really interesting again. And now kind of nearing the end of the first part of our panel discussion here, I'm very excited to introduce our last speaker, West Papua campaigner Raki up to share his view and experience of the COP26. And again, to just provide us all with some background on Raki, currently works as a civil servant at the Ministry of Interior of the Netherlands. And after actually going back to a time after the murder of his father Arnold Ab, his mother, 3 brothers and him fled to the Netherlands, where he then entered the Dutch army. Because he wanted to contribute to international peace and security. The military service gave a good foundation to his turbulent youth, but at the same time also provided him with discipline, knowledge, and experience, all of which he's currently been using over the last 10 years in a storytelling campaign. In the meantime, he's known as an all-around activist who's committed to political, human rights, and climate activism, because in West Papua, all three elements have common ground. In the Netherlands, Raki currently tries to give the climate debate a more indigenous perspective, because for him to solve climate change in only 8 years, we shouldn't just turn around facts, but actually point out what really needs to be said. For him, the history of West Papua is one that includes passion, so that we can really inspire each other to win this important battle and truly tackle climate change. After this inspiring introduction, Raki, I would like to hand over to you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And first of all, I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me. And I want to thank the previous speakers for the sharing the important knowledges with us. And I hope I can contribute myself something as well. I went to Glasgow and I was over there to create a lot of awareness around the Indigenous perspective on climate change in the context of climate justice. Can I see hands from all of you who have heard about the Indigenous perspectives on climate change? Can the moderator see how much hands we have put on there? Is it almost every hand, or I see a lot of hands? So a lot of you have heard. I will shine a little bit more context later on slide 5. For now, the next slide, please, just the bullets in my presentation. The real to COP, so my experiences, what the mission, my mission in Glasgow, some highlights, experiences and collaborations in Glasgow with grassroots particularly, and at the end, my campaign harvest and the way ahead, which I wanted to share with you. Good, next slide, please. So I was invited to join the climate train, which traveled from Amsterdam to Brussels and then all the way to Glasgow, where I've been invited to join a panel session in one of the coupés together with Oxfam Nova Belgium. And they asked me to shine a light from the Indigenous point of view in the context of climate justice regarding a fair and sustainable travel for all. So this, I'm gonna briefly share my perspective regarding this specific theme. To reflect within the train, and there were a lot of stakeholders there, I want them to reflect the current status where we are in. Innovation had brought us in this situation. From the moment industrialization started, that's the moment the carbon emission increases, right? That's what science has told us. So what we have seen is that we have to accept in the first place that innovation, the way we live, the way we consume, the way we use energy, have caused this climate crisis. I think we can agree with that. So before we reflect on how we going to build another fair and sustainable travel for all, where are these resources are coming from? Not from Amsterdam, nor from London or Europe, they're coming from the global south, particularly. And in West Papua, my homeland, which has the world's largest gold mine, and also which is part of Indonesia, which is the world's largest exporter of nickel, which is one of the top 3 elements we use in solar panels, batteries, and so on. Just keep that in mind. So without reducing our use of energy at this moment, without reducing our consuming behavior, which we should do to reduce our carbon emissions, we are willing to put a so-called fair and sustainable railway in Europe. This is just one example, because we want to create a green transition. Without understanding that we must reduce our energy use, we're going to put a new system right to the one we have today. You don't have to be a scientist to understand that the energy use is going to increase, and we're going to use more resources to create that green transition. So who's going to pay that price for the green transition? Once again, it's going to be the people, the local people around those mining areas. And this is where the indigenous perspective is coming from, knowing that West Papua, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, these are some highlights from the Dutch broadcast agency who picked me, who interviewed me in the train together with some high-profile figures, which is Frans Timmermans, EU Commissioner, and the railway presidents of EU and the Netherlands. Next slide, please. So my mission in Glasgow was to launch the so-called Green State vision of West Papua. For those who doesn't know where West Papua is, it's the western half of the island of New Guinea, right above Australia. What is interesting and important about West Papua for every climate activist, and especially the green institutions who are talking about we have to preserve Earth's biodiversity, ecosystem restoration, and so forth, West Papua is part of the world's largest tropical island, and it houses the second/third largest rainforest after the Amazon. It's described as one of the most unique biodiversity hotspots in the world. So you should expect that environmental organizations know what is happening there. But the reality is they don't. They are shocked that by an article of me, which started, I think, 2 years ago, where I was involved as an indigenous climate activist. They don't know nothing about the genocide and ecocide happening on what should be a frontline area. And this is what I describe as a deadly silence. So the indigenous perspectives on the climate crisis is basically built on a fundamental outcome of the UN scientists, which says that just 5% of the world's population exists of indigenous peoples, and their way of life have preserved more than 80% of world's remaining biodiversity. And West Papua is such a clear case. That's why the island is so unique, and it's still a biodiversity hotspot, because indigenous peoples live in full balance with their environment, but they are threatened because their rights are not accepted. So what we have launched here is to show the world that there is a way out, that more than 96% of all deforestation due to fossil fuel activities, due to mining, due to soya and palm oil, happens on the same indigenous lands. So the first solution from our point of view is to protect the indigenous rights, so the trees will stay there, the animals and biodiversity will stay intact, and extractive industries won't extract those resources, and we will have less carbon emissions in the air. So the narrative is very different. It's not about solar panels, it's about protecting human lives and those who defend Earth's ecosystems. So this is what we launched in the UK. Next slide, please. Some highlights is that I had the opportunity to stand on stage with a lot of activists, including the world famous Greta Thunberg, where I educated about the importance of protecting indigenous rights as most obvious climate solutions. These are the protectors of our frontline areas. Next slide, please. So we got some amazing coverage about indigenous peoples and not represented the way they should be at COP26. As we heard before, that it is one of the most inclusive COPs, and understanding that indigenous peoples play a fundamental role in preserving Earth's ecosystems. Next slide, please. So what I've experienced there was an amazing energy, not within the green and blue zone, but among the grassroots movements, from Extinction Rebellion to indigenous peoples, where we have collaborated and joined protests together in Glasgow. And that's where, the energy was really, really positive and optimistic. And that the collaboration was really, really good. And it was needed. Next slide, please. Because some points as campaign harvest is that I met a lot of indigenous peoples, and I feel the same disappointment that those who preserve and protect frontline areas, such as in West Papua and the Amazon, felt that they were not heard not by governments. That's what we can expect, but also by environmental organizations, which you should expect that they support the frontline defenders, but it didn't happen. Another thing is that, we've heard it before, that the biggest delegation at COP26 were the fossil fuel lobbyists, which is, a sad thing. And this is an important element which I brought back to the environmental organizations in the Netherlands, that at COP26 train from Amsterdam to Glasgow, I was the only indigenous activist, knowing that this is a fundamental perspective within the climate change debate, and also that we can say that the outcome is a big farce with not hard agreements, no rights of indigenous peoples protected. But at the last point, I got a lot of inspiration by the movement over there and indigenous peoples I've met. And next slide, please. So this is the way forward. I want all of you to understand I can expect that Shell won't do the right thing. I can expect that a conservative government or that of the liberals in the Netherlands wouldn't take the necessary steps. But I have a problem if environmental organizations are taking the same attitude. They are the ones who should listen and facilitate indigenous peoples, who are the Earth's best protectors of Earth's ecosystems. I found some students supporting me to outline some facts. Next slide, please. This is what I found out. Just in 1 year, I've just scanned the 4 biggest environmental organizations in the Netherlands. Just look at the numbers. This is mind-blowing. That I had to pay my own train ticket to the UK, while Oxfam Novib facilitated a lot of my comrades of Extinction Rebellion to stay there for 1 week. This is about inclusiveness reflections to the environmental organizations. If they say, listen to the scientists, and the scientists are saying indigenous peoples are the most important stakeholders, how is it possible that we have to fight for our seat on the table? Well, they spend millions a year. And I want you to reflect that all of these employees, there's none of them who focus on the role of indigenous rights and indigenous peoples. And this is the problematic facts. Next slide, please. Because it is science that indigenous peoples, next slide once again, they're the most important stakeholder, and yet the environmental organizations spend millions a year without having those important stakeholders sitting on the table to make a strategy together, to make them have a big say within whatever COP, and to make forward a joint, campaign or strategy. And I think this is a problematic position from my point of view. Next slide, please. And I'm coming to an end. So the way forward for us is to maximum investment in collaborations with grassroots, such as YEMA, but also Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, because they understand the importance role of indigenous peoples. And a constant process to educate people about indigenous perspective, but also put pressure on green institutions, especially, so they take an important role to facilitate this perspective. Next slide. And in the Netherlands, yesterday, we had a first meeting with the director of Friends of the Earth, Milieudefensie, for him to understand, to reflect on this number that more than 300 euros a year are spent, and how it's possible that indigenous activists have to fight for their seat on the table. They are part of the problem, while indigenous people are clearly the solution. And this is the way forward to build momentum together with the grassroots, but also holding environmental organizations accountable for their position in this entire climate crisis. Thank you. That's it from my side.
Thank you very much, Raki, for sharing your perspective. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for bringing the indigenous perspective here on the table as well. I think that was a really, really valuable addition to the panel discussion. Thank you very much. Also, I think now is a really good point to just thank all of our panelists for being here today. Just really, we are very grateful you took the time. Thank you very, very much. But also thank you very much to the audience and everyone watching the recording. We're very grateful for all of you being here today. And this is really rounding off the first part of our panel discussion, which were the individual speakers. And I think now would be a really nice time to take a break, to maybe reflect and kind of digest everything that's been said, maybe grab a cup of tea or something. So we invite you all to take a 5-minute break maybe until 7:30 or yeah, 7:30, if that's fine with everyone. And then we can have like half an hour of a discussion to really engage with all the views, connect with it, and bringing the questions from the audience. So yes, I'm very much looking forward to seeing you all back at 7:30.
Okay, yeah, it was sorry, it was kind of a short break. But yeah, we still want to have time for discussion, so we're going to wait a little bit for the rest to join, like minutes, and then I'll introduce our discussion. Okay, I think most of us are back. So for our discussion, yeah, now it's time for now we have the speakers. It's time for our participants to take the stage. So if you have a question or you just want to say something or like raise an issue that you find important, raise your hand, and our moderators, Nikki, will pick you out, call you out, and give you the floor. You can also ask your question in the chat. And if you're and then Magnor or Nikki will ask it for you. And if you're a little bit shy, you can also do it anonymously and send your question like directly only to Magnor or Nikki in the chat, and they will make sure it's being asked to speakers or whoever is speaking at that moment. Yeah, so, but also feel free to just take on observing role. If you cannot think about anything to say or about a question and just want to listen, it's also fine. Yeah, so if anyone already has a question, please raise your hand. And yeah, we're just curious to see what's going to happen and the discussions we'll see.
So our first question is for all of our speakers. And the person asks, if you imagine an ideal COP conference, what do you envision? What would happen and what? Sorry, I heard that I cut out. What do you envision and what would the outcomes be?
Yeah, so whoever on speakers wants to answer that, yeah, you can start.
Well, I will give a kickoff then, in that case. From my point of view, as I mentioned before, that UN scientists have outlined the importance role Indigenous peoples have played, are playing by preserving Earth's ecosystems. I think they should have a big say within COP26 and regarding what kind of policy there will be come out. And to give one example to that is that we saw a global news momentum regarding the commitment of COP26 leaders that they wanted to stop deforestation by the end of 2030. How are they going to do that without protecting the rights of Indigenous people, because it is their land? So this is a perspective from my side. You have to give them a big say within whatever policy making process. That's it. Thank you.
I think also in lines what Raki said. For me, well, I was part of the Climate Adaptation Summit, and at that stage, I was talking about youth engagement and the role of youth. And then I said exactly what Raki said, which like to really have a seat on the table. So I think for me, it's like we need to make sure that the stakeholders that are actually involved in the different climate crisis and the climate outcome, they really have a seat on the table, and not one speech in a COP there everyone's going to clap, but in the end when we are going to go for the discussions of the real outcomes, well, they are not part of it, and they feel and then to be able to do that, I do believe that it's necessary that we feel comfortable to share what we need. Because, well, just getting a bridge also on what Raki said, like we need to make sure that Indigenous people, their thoughts, they are taken into account, but they need to feel comfortable also to share, because we also know how hard it is, the reality out there, and they can, well, really suffer for their lives. So I think you also need to make sure that that is like this comfortable arena for us to talk. And to finish, for me, that we live there with tangible outcomes, that we do something, like, you know, that there are mechanisms in place that are tangible things that they come out of a COP. So I think my thoughts would be more on those lines.
Can I, yeah. So to bounce back a little bit on Anna's point about the youth, I cannot emphasize more how important it is for those kind of conferences to engage with the youth. I think that a lot of different institutions are already made. So for example, like the main one that I'm thinking of is Yongo, which is basically the UNFCCC's institution for youth. So they are the one that organized the Conference of Youth that is happening the weekend before COP26. So I had the chance to be part of this conference, and honestly, like I cannot emphasize how amazing of an experience this was, to be part of so many inspiring and inspired young people from literally all around the world. Like, it was such an amazing experience to just, you know, talking with someone from Japan and then another person from Uganda. It was an amazing thing. And we were all together talking about our experiences and how we would like to contribute and what should be done to be contributed. And at the end of this weekend was the creation of a 2-year-long statement that we called the Global Youth Statement. It was a 70 pages document with recommendations from all around the world, literally all around the world. And there was this whole ceremony where so the leaders of the Yongo pretty much gave the document to Alok Sharma and to Patricia Espinosa. It was amazing. Like, it was really a moment where I thought, oh my God, it is actually happening, you know? Those leaders of Yongo had their seat in the table, but they were the last to talk. Their words, you know, there's always like this kind of feeling where, oh, okay, like, we're gonna let you talk because we need to let you talk. It's the rule that, you know, because everyone tells me that you need to talk, so you're gonna talk, but we're not really gonna listen, because at the end of the day, like, your impact is on a very surface level. And I think a lot of different stakeholders, their impact is on a surface level. I think it would be important that this negotiation room is way more transparent. What is happening in the negotiation room? We need to know what exactly, who is talking, who has the actual power. It's such a big question that who actually writes those rules, you know? So yes, basically, just to round it up, have an actual voice of the youth, have an actual voice of the people that are not heard every day, and have an actual discussion on what is actually happening.
Thank you so much. Raki, Anna, and you, would any of the other speakers like to address the question, or can we take the next question from Yana? Okay, I think Yana, you have the floor.
Thanks. Can you hear me? I am new to this microphone. Cool. I wanted to ask a question to Veerle. So you mentioned the t-shirt story, and I think that that story was very powerful. It represented on a physical ground what is happening at COP26, how the rules are restrictive, the space is restrictive, and you could physically see the restriction because you were literally confiscated. The t-shirt was confiscated. And I was wondering, how was the t-shirt story then solved? Because we didn't really get a glimpse into, okay, so what really happened? So they just took the t-shirt, did you argue with them? What happened? Because I can imagine I would be very surprised by someone telling me, hey, take off your t-shirt, this is too political for this space. Can you elaborate on that?
Thanks, Yana. That's a great question. Yeah, I should have rounded up the story instead of leaving you with a cliffhanger. I think I left you mainly with a cliffhanger because I didn't want it to be about, it's not about me. This story isn't about me. It's about a simple t-shirt that represents a much larger problem, which is why I used it as an anecdote in my talk. And the ending isn't so dramatic. Obviously, I got it back in the end, but it's more, I think, the process of bureaucratic the bureaucratic process that I had to go through in order to claim back an item which I thought contained a message of the truth, which had every right to be in this space, yet I had to go through this process and was confronted with so much, such an imbalance in power in simply wearing this T-shirt, right? And I was also reflecting upon what it would have meant had I worn a T-shirt saying net zero by 2050. Would it have been confiscated? I don't think so, right? So I think that's much more important than reflecting upon the individual experience, which was uncomfortable, but I also know I recognize my privileges. I'm a white woman and I was able to move through this space in a fairly uninhibited way. But actually to build off the question that was posed before, and it's connected to this, there's something wrong with that as well, right? So I can feel ideologically really upset about the fact that this shirt's taken away from me because I know that it's wrong, but it doesn't harm me personally because I'm still able to freely move through this space. But that's because this space is organized around Eurocentric principles and ways of relating to one another. And that's not comfortable to the majority of people that should be welcomed into this space. And I think if all of that was reorganized, we shouldn't have our shirts confiscated, right? So it's all connected. So I think that's a much more elaborate response to your question, but I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Veerle, for sharing your story. It's really powerful. And so now there's a question in the chat. I think it's directed to Raki. It's from Sarah, I hope I'm saying that right. I was wondering what kind of feedback did you get from the director of the Milieu Defensie?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, most of it is still secret because, but the outcome in general is that I think Milieu Defensie is a really is the most I think green of environmental organization in the Netherlands who are taking the lead to take the indigenous perspective on climate change very seriously. They've asked me and other pan-decolonial indigenous organizations to hold webinars for the employees and for the members. And I think this is a really important step for an institution to underline the words of the UN scientists, to facilitate in the institution so employees who are making future policies regarding ecosystem restoration or biodiversity or deforestation to understand the importance of the indigenous perspective. So I'm really optimistic. I can't say a lot, but there is a lot of commitment spoken out by the director, and I hope this will be the first, let me say, domino stain for other big environmental organizations in the Netherlands who are talking a lot about, you know, we take care about ecosystem restoration, but still not accepting the indigenous perspective to have a conversation with us. So I think Milieu Defensie is taking the lead. We're not yet there because time is running out. We have to see it concrete, but these are really optimistic steps. That's it. I hope I've answered your question, Sarah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I think Leander has a question now.
Yeah, thank you. We're talking a lot about world leaders, decisions, bureaucratic decision making, and that's often, of course, what is when you think about COP. But I'm wondering more like a general question. What do you guys think the ordinary citizen should do, or what can they do to inspire the movement and also work towards more like that equal future, green future?
I think I can just start maybe. I do believe we need to, one of the things that we need to make pressure, I do believe, as society on to try to get the answer that we need, but also the actions that we aim for from the leaders. I also think we need to, well, now a little bit, well, after getting a little bit older, my view is that we also need to understand the system that we are in and how we can play within the system to make changes. So I do believe, for me, the power of youth and young people, it's extremely powerful, and I am someone passionate in education, so I do believe that in a long term, it can come to the transition, the behavioral transition that we need to have. And in the short term, I would say for us, the young people and the not so young people anymore, how to discuss very openly how we can work together with the system that we have towards a fair change. I know sometimes it seems hard and even utopical for me, but I do believe it's possible if we acknowledge that there are differences. Those differences needs to be taken into account, and we need to, well, live and learn how to deal with, well, when something is not the way that we, well, would like to. But I do believe that we need to have this bond. Not sure if I really answered, very philosophical, but it's also hard.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Yeah, no, my question was more like we're talking about a lot about world leaders and bureaucratic decision making, but what can the ordinary citizen do to go to more like desired green or equitable future?
Mm-hmm. My answer will be pretty short. I think that the most important thing that the ordinary citizen should do is to, first of all, spread awareness around them. If you are aware of what is happening, because unfortunately a lot of people, I mean, I would argue that everyone knows that we are in a crisis, but no one actually really knows that we're in a crisis. For a lot of the population, climate change is about you know, the polar bear in this ice cap. While it's not only this, right? So the first step would be to actually inform ourselves on what is actually happening. Why is it a crisis? Who it is actually touching? What is the vulnerable groups that are actually already having this impact? And then just, you know, spreading awareness on, okay, I saw that this is happening. I don't really agree with this. What do you think about it? Or, you know, just having a little change in habits. While it's not actually going to solve the issue, it's just those small habits that at the end of the day might be able to make a change. But the most important thing I would definitely say is it's about political will and political action. So to me, the most important part would be to actually vote to those leaders that are aware of what is happening, are able to hear the population, because a lot of leaders cannot, for the love of God, hear anything that the population want to say. You know, elect those leaders that are powerful and are actually aware of the change that they want to make, and especially climate related.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I totally agree, and I'm yeah, very inspired by what you and Anna have said so far. And then I see Raki has raised his hand, and Isadora raised their hand as well earlier, so maybe in that order. And then I think there's some more questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you. Just to reflect on the particular question, I think from my personal point of view, my life experience, for those who doesn't know, I'm not an academic yet. I've just finished my, I don't know how you say that, perhaps Veerle can say it, MBO for the people in English. But I've shown the Dutch society, but also these green institutions and a lot of powerful established institutions that one person can make a difference. I've showed that. That's my life experience the last 2 years. I've shook the entire Dutch climate change movement by bringing in the importance of this indigenous perspectives. And if you look what the situation in West Papua is, it's one of the most militarized zones colonized by Indonesia. We have the world's largest gold mine. Indonesia has blocked NGO and media for the last 60 years. And the Dutch government have kept this a secret for more than 60 years, what's happening in their former colony. We have changed the entire narrative. Without freedom, with very little resources, you can Google yourself. And from my point of view, knowing that we have created so much change and momentum, we're just starting. Nobody in the Netherlands, but also in the global north, can say me that change is not possible if you see what we have realized the last 10 years. And that's what I wanted to bring forward to all of you, to believe in yourself. And it takes courage to create change, to fight against indeed shells. But it is possible. I've shown it. It was Papua have shown it. And the humankind have shown it that we've ended slavery as well. And this is the biggest challenge for us all. So we have to be fearless. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention, and this was already talked here, about the importance of being a part of the movement or local or national or even international groups like Young Friends of the Earth, which work directly or indirectly for climate justice. I think this is one of the main takeaways that I also took from this COP. By following the parallel conference, as I mentioned before, the People Summit for Climate Justice, and how I could witness how the movement is going is getting bigger and stronger throughout the years. Of course, it's also a lot due to the really good organization that the local groups in the UK had for the event, but they also had many challenges to make it happen. So I think being involved in the conversation, not only the official conversation on climate change, like attending the conferences, but also being a part of the alternative spaces, as they call it, or the climate justice spaces, is really interesting and really important to bring always the perspective and the solutions of movements for climate justice all around the world. And for example, I would suggest looking up Demand Climate Justice, DCJ, one of the groups, or Friends of the Earth, as I think most of you are already even a part of it.
Great, thank you so much. I think I don't remember who had their hand up first, either it was Yana or Nika. We're also coming close to 8 p.m. So we're probably gonna take like the last few questions and wrap it up, or yeah, might go a few minutes over. Hope that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I was just wondering, so kind of with all these discussions which we're having, and I feel like it's been mentioned a lot by all of the panelists, that there has been like a really growing grassroots movement, and it's really inspiring, and it's like, I guess it's really nice to see that. But what I hear a lot is that they're like kind of parallel. So there's the official COP with this exclusionary blue zone from Veerle's story as well, and then there is like the young COP event, and like Isadora, you also mentioned this parallel COP event. And I keep wondering, how can you bridge the two? Like how can it be possible to break this exclusive COP lobbying structure of like politicians and kind of, well, maybe that's a very simplistic way of thinking, but like the elite who holds the power, because it's very, very simplified now. But how is it possible to break this open and actually put something on the internal agenda where decisions are being made? If anyone has a perspective on that, like I'd be very curious to hear it. also, maybe it's easier if I ask a speaker directly. I just realized. I don't know, maybe Isadora, do you have an idea on that? Because I found your intersectional climate justice perspective really interesting.
I was just writing down that I actually have to leave at 8, but could you please repeat the question again, because I was writing down and I couldn't really hear.
For sure. Just in short, my question was like, how can you break open this exclusionary bubble of the official COP, like this kind of the politicians and the lobbyists, the businesses all sitting together? How can you break open this decision-making bubble as a grassroots movement?
I think it's very difficult to answer that, because for many years, I think I've heard, and also myself have considered boycotting those conferences, or even, but I always come to the conclusion that it's more worth it to attend, and like to always try to bring more people from our constituencies to that, because the bigger the movements, I think the bigger the pressure that we can make on the demands that we have. And even so, we constantly leave those conferences with lots of frustration. But I don't know. I think it's definitely cross-constituency and so solidarity among the different and let's say more aligned constituencies is a very important strategy to break this silo and to make us more heard, or more even to have more seat at the table. And we always try to align the demands of climate justice groups in that space, in that official space for what we're demanding. Yeah, I think I would say this one thing, which is a very intersectional also strategy, I would say, to try to combine and to have like common strategies along the various constituencies that participate in that arena.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for being here. And if you have to leave, no worries. And yeah, I think Jana and Camille have questions. So Jana, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, again, mic check, mic check, mic check. Okay, cool. I wanted to know from all the speakers, what do you hope for in COP27 happening in November in Egypt? It's a big event again, another COP, another opportunity for performative representativeness per se. What do you hope for? And I will direct it to Stuart, and I would appreciate if then other panelists can share their views, because I am very interested.
Thanks, Kiana. But yeah, I don't really participate in conferences, either academic ones or activist ones. I think, so I can't really answer your question, but for me, it's focusing locally is important. And I think about what all of you are doing locally, whether it's in education or civil society or the workplace and so forth, is going to be crucial, because unless that work is happening, it doesn't really matter what we do at a conference, right? It's that broader organizing that I think will be key.
I think for me, Anna, it's like more representation. I think, well, we've been talking about this a lot, but just one parallel that I can make it with the food summit that it happened, in which we really had different stakeholders all together deciding on outcomes. So for me, it would be really interesting, not necessarily that we have something the same, because we know it's not the shape of the COP, but actually that we could see this interaction in a much more, well, maybe honest manner, so to say. So I think if we do have this, we can try to start having a little bit of more representativeness and inclusiveness in the decisions as well.
What I would personally like for COP27 is, in COP26, a lot of important people were not present. So, for example, the president of China was not even at COP26. I think that for us to actually advance in the many ways that we want to advance, political representation, it is important, and especially from everyone, and especially from the biggest polluter in the world. So yes, I definitely think that everyone should be there, way more inclusive than it was last time. Just also more political decisions regarding vulnerability and loss and damage that was talked, but no action was there. So yes, just finalize a lot of articles. There is so much to be done, so it's quite complicated.
Yeah, to add from my point of view is just to underline that before COP26, we've heard that this was the most important COP to come, but we faced the most inclusive COP ever. And at the same time, the lack of actions are on the table once again. So I have no illusions. The only realization is that we have to work very hard, locally, nationally, and work across borders with those who understand the crisis we are in. That's the only, reality check for me. And that's what I do every single day from my humble position. I've seen with my friends that we can inspire each other. And I think, the big changes history has shown that come from the edges. And we've seen that the 26 COP, those who are in power, those corporate greeds, they don't take the right steps. So it's up to us to make sure that the pressure is rising within your city, within your country, and that we win elections in our favor, and to build that momentum internationally. I think Greta Thunberg have shown that change is possible, that one student from 16 years old can create the global movement, Black Lives Matter. And I think this must inspire us every single day that change is possible. But we have to make sacrifices to make the commitment to create work towards a change. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. And would any other speaker like to add anything, or can we move on to the next question? Okay, I think last question then, because we're already a little over time, so sorry about that.
All right. Well, my question kind of follows after an earlier question where we talked about what an individual can do. And I heard Stuart talking about the difference between individual behavioral change and system change. And therefore, I kind of have a question for him also, since he says that he doesn't attend these conferences, which I think are part of the current system, whether he has any insights or ideas about how we can structure like international cooperation among climate movements in another way, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think what Raki just said, I kind of think about organizing nationally and across borders and so forth through the different organizations. But for me, it's that work that's going to make the difference about whatever happens at these conferences. Conferences kind of follow rather than lead, I think. And in terms of the kind of moving beyond just the individual behavior change, which continues to be such a dominant focus of climate action, is I mean, I think there are climate organizations already that possibly you're involved with that are doing this. And what I was trying to say in the talk is that there's a lot we can learn from by looking beyond the narrow sphere of climate. I think some of the most exciting movements are ones that are linking climate to other issues that are affecting people's lives, whether it's jobs or homes or racism, colonialism, so forth. And when we kind of expand out that way, we can learn from other organizing traditions and educational traditions that have tried to do things around structural change rather than just individual behavior change.
Then do you still think there is a role for these big conferences in the future?
I'm sure there is, but it will be the after effect rather than hoping that things will start or come from there.
If I could just quickly add, I think that structural change is scary to a lot of people. Telling all those elites and just anyone and everyone, okay, from now on, we need to change the way we think, the way we act, and the way our future will be, is a scary, scary, scary thought. bringing it to the table is one thing, but also making it happen is another. So I definitely agree that we should do it, but I think that we need to find a way to actually make it happen without, by making sure that change is happening smoothly. Like the transition phase has to be smooth, has to be made in a way that it's not like too brutal. So this is why I think, we need to do a lot of work on innovation, because from now, like I just read an article about like 2 days ago, just pretty much showing that change is possible and change is needed, but for us to make a change is going to cost a lot of money. And as soon as we talk about money, a lot of people are, getting, I don't want to do it if I'm going to lose money, right? So innovation wise, we need to do a lot of efforts. We need to make sure that the innovations that are carbon neutral are accessible to everyone. The question of fairness, like why would someone in a developing country should buy an electric car if a fuel car is way cheaper? Like there's still a lot of work to be done. And especially like in those 10 years, we need to have our emissions by 2030. A lot of work has to be done in the policy work, but also a lot of work on the innovation.
Okay, well, thank you all for this interesting discussion. It sure gave me a lot of new things to think about, and I hope everyone has learned something new from this as well. I'd like to wrap up the session, and thanks for all the amazing speakers for joining us and also investing their time in this event. And also thanks to the public for joining us and joining in the discussion. And we sure hope to see you next time. For now, I'll have a great evening. And thank you for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great.
It was great. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.